information in their own way, what they thought made sense. They said, let's have a centralized unit that coordinates all this, and it can point out ways to do it better. So this was the brainchild of Ivan Aganyants, a very high-ranking KGB official, and it was duplicated in Eastern Europe in the early 60s. East Germany, the Czechoslovakia at that time, Hungary and Bulgaria all formed different units. And in fact, one of the best reporting on this is from a defector, Ladislav Bittman. He went by the name of Larry Martin here in the United States. He taught at Boston University, but he wrote a book called The Deception Game in 1972. And it's still very good because he was there at the beginning, and he was a deputy chief of the department in Czechoslovakia. So I was just rereading it last night, and there's always something to learn when you reread a good article. But he had the plans, the basic objectives were very similar to what they are now. Like he said, they wanted to get rid of NATO because they thought without the US and NATO, they could easily dominate Western Europe. And of course, we're facing the same situation now with our former president, Donald Trump, who's running for president again. He said openly that he wants to, get rid of NATO. He doesn't believe in that, which would be catastrophic, in my opinion. But look, he got elected president once. Americans don't pay a lot of attention to foreign affairs. We're a very big country, and he could get elected again. It's very, I wouldn't say it's likely, but it's not unlikely. It could go either way. But the goals are the same. They want to weaken the United States, and there's a KGB dictionary, and under active measures, it said the goals are to exert influence on the adversary and to weaken his political, economic, scientific, technical, and military positions. And that's exactly what they're doing now. They're trying to weaken us, but talking about exerting influence, there's a very good article in the Washington Post just this morning. It's by a woman, Catherine Belton, who is a Washington Post reporter, but she previously wrote a very good biography of Putin. So she's very, very astute, very understands the Soviet Union, Russia very well, and the intelligence services. So I would recommend that article. You can see what they're doing today to try to influence the debate on aid to Ukraine, because of course this is critical. There's like $40 million, $60 million worth of aid that's been tied up for months by the Republicans at the behest of Trump. And, this is very important because, as we all know, Ukraine's running out of ammunition. So the Russians are doing their best through influence operations in the United States and in many, many other countries, but in the United States to try to influence our domestic debate about aid to Ukraine. And there was just one thing they said that, they gave it. It's so easy for them to do this now with social media. They can create a fake social media persona and, say anything they want. And one of them is instructing them to saying, that overspending on foreign policy is not good for the interests of white people in the United States. The idea is America's going to lose. We could get drawn into war, and our guys could die in Ukraine. So, this is not going to happen, but that's what they want people to believe. And basically, the thing about disinformation, you have to shape disinformation around what people believe could happen. You can't just come up with some crazy story that nobody's going to believe. I remember during the 1991 Gulf War, I was countering Iraqi disinformation, and there was a story that they were dumping toxic waste in the Gulf. And nobody cared about this, right? I mean, it would have been a big story in Western Europe, but it just disappeared. But then there was another story, and I don't think the Iraqis invented it. I think it was a spontaneously created conspiracy theory or urban legend that said American soldiers were walking around Mecca and Medina naked and throwing beer cans on the prophet's tomb, which would be terrible sacrilege. So anytime, you are violating the sacred objects or the sacred beliefs of any other culture, that's something that people are going to get furious about. So that's perfect for disinformation. So, and what are some of the things that people are typically suspicious of and think might happen? People are very suspicious of intelligence agencies, right? I was just talking to an old boss of mine. I used to 52 years ago when I was young, I worked construction for him. He owns a construction company. He's very successful, but he's older now. He's retired, but he believes all these crazy conspiracy theories. And, a lot of people do. So that's that's one thing. You can make a conspiracy theory about intelligence agencies, about CIA. People are worried about biological weapons. That's a natural fear. And that they're talking about biolabs in Ukraine. Now, I know what those are about. Those are about collecting dangerous, diseases or any kind of things that pose a biological danger in countries of the former Soviet Union and in other countries to make it a safer world. But the Russians just turn it around and they say these are, creating weapons. Now, the United States during the Cold War, one of the biggest disinformation stories was that the U.S. military had created the virus that causes AIDS in a laboratory. And there's a laboratory about an hour away from Washington called Fort Detrick, where they used to do research on biological weapons because during World War II, the Japanese in particular, they were making a lot of biological weapons, and they tested these on Chinese prisoners of war. Terrible, terrible story. But we figured we had to do it too. But after that, in 1969, they said, we don't really, they're not really that useful because they're indiscriminate. You create a biological weapon, how are you going to get it to stop? It can spread everywhere. So they shut it down, but they still do research on biological defense, how to protect against it if somebody else does it, which is prudent. So the Soviets and they always used to run stories about Fort Detrick and biological weapons. Well, this was how the AIDS story came about. They said we were trying to make a biological weapon and it got loose. They were testing it, it got loose, and it spread to the nearest big city, New York. Now, New York is about, 400 kilometers from Fort Detrick or from Washington, D.C. There's also other big cities. Well, Washington's much closer to Fort Detrick. Baltimore is a big city. Philadelphia, but people don't know this. So people have heard of New York. They know it's on the East Coast. So they made this phony story, and it just went wild through the press. And they got it into the press by this newspaper in India called The Patriot. It's a English language newspaper. India used to be a British colony, so a lot of people there speak English. And it was set up by KGB. I know the guy who set it up, Ilya Zhurkvelov. He later defected. So they could put any story in that they wanted, and they did. And there was a story in 1983 about how Pakistan is doing all of these work with the United States and experimenting with these dangerous diseases, and that's a danger to India. So this is for the Indian audience. And then a couple of years later, they decided, 1985, they decided to do a worldwide campaign blaming AIDS on the United States. So they keep very good files. And they had this old story from 1983, and they ran it in Literatura Gazeta, which is known for, there's certain newspapers that are known for being where the KGB can plant stories. And Literatura Gazeta is one of them. So they planted it, and then TASS and Novosti, their news agency, run it, and it goes worldwide. And then they can have people, plant the story in news agencies in various countries and newspapers. It's all over the world, and even it made it onto CBS News. This Dan Rather in 1987, Novosti Military Bulletin, which is a KGB publication, had published the story, and it was picked up and reported, and he reported it on the CBS Evening News. He didn't say it was propaganda. He didn't say it was disinformation. He didn't call the Pentagon or the State Department to get their comment on it. We knew it was disinformation. He just ran it. So, and there it is. It's spread to millions of people. So it's amazing how these things can spread. And there was a lot of them. One of the ones that I worked on for many, many years, it started as a spontaneous rumor among social workers in Latin America. And we call it the baby part story, or for more formally, the child organ trafficking story. And this alleges that Americans are coming down to Latin America and adopting kids to use them for organ transplants. They're going to murder them and use their organs in organ transplants to save their natural born children. Totally crazy story and totally not true. But sort of the more horrible a story is, in some ways, the more it's shocking. And it's so shocking that the part of your brain that is rational is just overwhelmed. And you're just overwhelmed by how shocking it is. And you say, oh my God, that's terrible. I'm against it. And even there was a UN special rapporteur who's going to write a report on this. And I had been following this story since I started in 1987. I followed it very, very closely for 9 years, to 1996. And in 1994, I wrote a long report to the United Nations to discourage basically the special rapporteur from writing a report on it, which he declined to do. Because once you look at it, you realize it's just a rumor. It's just a rumor. And I went down to, in Virginia, which is not far from Washington, right next to Washington, D.C., there's an organization called the United Network for Organ Sharing. And they're a contractor with the federal government, with the Department of Health and Human Services, and they coordinate all the organ transplants because it's a complicated business. And basically, if somebody's in a traffic accident, typically, and they suffer, a terrible injury to their brain, and they're dead or going to be dead once they're taken off life support, but they might have their heart, their lungs, their liver, their kidneys might still be good, viable organs if they're, 40 years old or 50 years old even. But you have to match that to somebody who needs an organ, a recipient. And they're on waiting lists, and they have each part of the country, and they have to fly these organs once they're removed, put them on ice, and they have to be flown as quickly as possible and to be surgically implanted into a recipient who's got, say, a failing kidney or a failing heart and would die otherwise. So they're on a waiting list. So it's a very complicated procedure to match these two. So I went down there and I said, look, here's the rumor. Can you explain to me what's involved? And they explained it to me, and then I wrote it up and I cleared it with them. So you explain to people not just that this is a crazy rumor, but here's all the very good medical reasons it couldn't happen. Organs only, to do an organ transplant, you need like 10 people at a major medical center. And you can't do this clandestinely. You know, transplant physicians, they make a lot of money. They're very well paid. What incentive do they have to act criminally? Doesn't make any sense. So you go through all the logical reasons why this is, very, very, very unlikely. And this is how you counter it. And basically, I wrote up a 10 or 12 page, well, it started smaller, and I would add to it every time I get a new false claim. And you can send it out to a journalist if they're interested. We dealt with journalists overseas. I had a French journalist. He called me. He had been referred, he had heard this rumor. So he called the French organ transplant organization. They referred him to UNOS, the US Organ Transplant Organization. And the people there referred him to me. So within 2 phone calls, he's talking to me, and I've been tracking this rumor for years. So I sent him, my 5 or 10 page summary of why this couldn't happen and all the repeated investigations of why it isn't, they found no evidence for it 10, 15 times. And he wound up doing a story on how it's a false rumor, which is what you want. You want a media story explaining how this allegation is false. So that's how you counter disinformation. You got to do your homework. You got to be in contact with the media, and you want to get a corrective story into the press. And it worked very well. And I had a lot of people call me, and they'd say, I was about to, fly off to Central America to run this down. But then I looked at your summary, and I realized it's a nonsense story. That's exactly what you want. And, you get good at it by doing it. I mean, my boss was very good. He was a former communist. He'd been a kid communist in the United States from ages 15 to 17 in New York City. And then after the Korean War, he just said, wait a minute. They're saying South Korea attacked North Korea. That's not what I'm reading in the newspapers. And he became a hardcore anti-communist, and he was great. He worked up on Capitol Hill for many years. Then he worked at U.S. Information Agency, and he hired me in '87, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. But also, I'm working with all the embassies. They see a story in the press, and they get in touch with our office. It's just him and me. And after he retired in 1989, it was just me for 10 years. And you just do the research. You got to be very, very careful. And then you explain it, and you clear it with whoever is very knowledgeable about this to make sure it's correct. And then we would send it to our information officer in embassy, and they dealt with the press, and they'd say, look, this is a nonsense story. Why don't you print a corrective story, or however they thought the best way to deal with it? Because they're in country. We don't tell them what to do. We just research what the facts are. And that was great. That was USIA. It was a wonderful organization. It got merged into the State Department in 1999. So I had been actually, there was a reduction in force. There's too many people, and I didn't have a lot of seniority. So I was sent back to Voice of America, where I'd been before. And it took me a while, but finally got back to what was now part of State Department in 2003, 2004. And working on Iraqi disinformation during the second Gulf War. So, and then I did a lot on all the urban legends and all the disinformation, all the conspiracy theories around 9/11, September 11th attacks. Like the Twin Towers. That was a controlled demolition. People said, because I remember I saw it live on television. I was in a training course. And during the break between the sessions, they turn on CNN, and you see the World Trade Center, and it's on fire. And then you see a plane come in and hit the other tower. And you go, oh my God, this is a terrorist attack. And then you watch later in the day, the second tower collapses, and the first tower collapses. It was an unbelievable day. But unbelievable things tend to collect conspiracy theories. So people say, oh, it's a controlled demolition. So what did I do? I started doing research on this. And a lot of this, the internet had just been invented. But it's a great tool. So I found some articles by people who blow buildings. There's actually a magazine called Implosion World. Imploding, you explode something, it goes out. When it implodes something, it goes in. And that's what you want to do when you're taking down a building. You want to implode it so it doesn't create a lot of destruction out beyond the footprint of the building. So I talked to this guy. He was writing an article on, why this was not a controlled demolition. You could tell he was a professional. So I said, yeah, please do that. And then he wrote the article and I used it. And I talked to him and he says, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. We're going to blow up the Wilson Bridge. This is a major bridge over the Potomac River. They had built a new bridge. So they had to blow the old one. He says, you want to come? I said, yeah, I'd love to come. So they did it at midnight or, 2:00 in the morning. They had all the traffic. They planted explosives on each of the columns of the bridge. And then they go boom, 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 boom. And the thing just one after another, it falls into the water. They knew exactly what they were doing. They're professionals. This is their business. But this is kind of, I know a lot about organ transplants. I know about implosions from the World Trade Center. And I talked to the guys up there at the World Trade Center because there were 7 buildings, as I recall, in the World Trade Center, 7 or 8. And there was one of them that fell later. It was World Trade Center Building 7, as I recall. It was, it was 50 stories. It was not 110 stories, but it was damaged by the other buildings fell. So and then it collapsed later that afternoon. And then the story is, well, that was a controlled demolition, of course. So, I talked to the guy does public affairs up there, and I said, this is what I do. I'm countering conspiracy theories for overseas audiences. But can you explain to me about what happened with that building? So he explained it all. And I wrote it up and I cleared it with him and I used it on our website. We had an identifying misinformation website in the 1990s and 2000s at State Department. And then he would just he would get inquiries all the time. He'd say, just go to this website. It's got it all, because that's what you want to do. You want to get to the people who really know what they're talking about. You want to write it up so that it's easy for an average person to understand, and then clear it with the people who know what they're talking about, and then get it into the hands of journalists or any individual. There was a crazy story, this tsunami, I think it was in 2004, I don't remember, but it swamped, it was in the Indian Ocean. It was terrible. I mean, lots of people died, terrible tidal waves. And there was a U.S. military base in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. So they got a small tidal wave, but in shallow water, as it turns out, the tidal waves are much lower. In the deep ocean, they're very high. But Diego Garcia, the surrounding ocean is not that deep, so it was no big deal. But there was a disinformation story about it. So I talked to the Defense Department, and they said, look, the public affairs guy works in Japan. So they gave me his email. I talked to him. You get something going back and forth. You talk to those people, you get something written, and then you got it on the website. And again, this guy, he got inquiries. He would point it to the article on the website because I'd written it in non-technical language, but you had to make sure it was correct. So anyway, this was what I did for 25 years, all these crazy stories. And I won't go through all of them, but depleted uranium was an interesting story. This is a real substance. And when they take natural uranium, which is very mildly radioactive. They enrich it. They put it in a centrifuge and they spin it. And there's certain isotopes that are heavier. Those are the ones that are very radioactive. So when they spin it, they come to the edges of the centrifuge and then they take it out. And that's how they get enriched uranium, both for nuclear power plants and highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. And they got a lot of stuff that's left over. And they call it depleted uranium because it's depleted of much of its radioactivity. And it's a waste product, but it actually makes a very good weapon because it's extremely heavy. It's almost twice as heavy as lead. So they used it to make munitions to kill tanks. And we had an aircraft called the A-10, was used in the Gulf War, and it was designed to kill tanks. It would fire these depleted uranium warheads, which would pierce the armor of a tank and explode, and boom, it's all over. So the story was that depleted uranium was causing birth defects in Iraq. And, so I went and researched all this stuff. And you talk to scientists and you find out it's not very radioactive at all. I mean, you wouldn't want to have it around because it's a heavy metal, it's toxic, but unless you're living with it and it's not really a problem. But they had this crazy article in a London paper in 1991, this British Atomic Energy Authority. They said, well, there was enough depleted uranium fired in the Gulf War to kill 500,000 people. And you go, oh my God, that's terrible. But what do you mean? They would have to collect every shell that was fired. And look, if they fire these shells in the desert, they don't hit a tank, it goes into the sand. It goes like a meter under, several meters underground. You're never going to see that thing again. But if you could magically collect all the depleted uranium, grind it up, and get into dust, and then have each person, 500,000 people, inhale, a lethal dose, you could kill 500,000 people. So yeah, it's theoretically possible, but it's totally divorced from reality. But newspapers love sensational headlines. So this was a headline, and then it starts a hysteria. And the Iraqis noticed this, and they started saying, oh, there's all these terrible things happening with cancer and birth defects. So again, I get all the research. You go to these, turns out NATO and World Health Organization and a bunch of people have done studies on depleted uranium, and they found it really, it doesn't have any significant health, harm. And I even talked to somebody up at the Veterans organization in Baltimore, and they said there are a bunch of people that have shrapnel. They've got shrapnel in their body, and this is like 20 years after the Gulf War, and they're not sick. Some of them get sick, like everybody's going to get sick, but there's no link to illness caused by depleted uranium, which they have in their body for decades. So you try to explain it to people. And I remember I was talking to my boss once, I'm saying, this and that, and here's the reason. And he goes, that's all well and good, but I wouldn't want to have one of those depleted uranium rounds on my desk. And I walk out and I go, what's going on here? It's not like he's suspicious of the State Department. We both work for the State Department. It's not that he thinks I'm sloppy. He knows I do my homework and I produce good work. Why is he still hesitant? And I said, wait a minute. And I realized it's the unconscious associations that we have with the word uranium. Like, I don't know about you, but when I grew up in the 1950s, it was a big thing about Hiroshima, atomic weapon, and birth defects, right? And all these horrible things, which were real when they dropped an atomic bomb right on a city. hundreds of thousands of people there. And there was radioactive fallout, and there was radiation sickness and birth defects. So a lot of people heard about this because it's a horror story. But I think that's what was going on. People have these unconscious associations with the word uranium, and it leads them to be especially primed, to be especially these. They're listening to the unconscious, subconscious part of their mind. They're not listening to the conscious mind that's saying, "Oh, it's not dangerous." How could it not be dangerous? It's uranium. That's what the unconscious part of their mind is saying. And it's very powerful. Yeah, I noticed it myself. You notice in other people. And there's a great book. I just wrote a Substack article on this. Daniel Kahneman, he won the Nobel Prize as a psychologist, and he talks about the unconscious associations we have and thinking fast and slow. When we think fast, we use intuition. We make an immediate snap decision about people based on who they are, what they look like, what we can pick up, nonverbal language. And that's the fast intuitive thinking. It's very good, but sometimes it's very bad because it doesn't take account of logic. It's all impressions. So I came to the conclusion, and this is before I'd read Kahneman's book, but later I realized it fit into what he was saying. They had these associations with depleted uranium, just like the organ trafficking story, just like the AIDS story. It's a horror story, and people are horrified and they're scared and they're against it. But then if you got to slow down, get people to think slowly using logic, which is not easy. And he explains in the book, people are basically lazy. They just want to form a surface opinion. Don't bother me with the logic. It takes too long. It's too hard. And I had to do all the hard work of taking all these complex issues and then making it fairly simple. So I could give people something simple. It wasn't too hard to overcome their instinctual, unconscious, subconscious associations. So that's a lot of what countering disinformation and misinformation is mistaken, unintentional. Disinformation is deliberate, but they overlap a lot because the Russians and the Soviets in their day and the Russians, they want to play on what people are going to believe. So that's how it's done. Now, I've talked for a long time, so why don't I take questions and be glad to address any questions you have. Thank you.
Todd, thank you. Listening to you, I was constantly thinking what a psychological challenge you had to really work with those nonsense conspiracies and try to turn this long thinking mind into play. Actually, lots of questions are dropping into my feed here, and I, without any pause, would like to start with what I got already in the chat, and I see already some hands. So let me start with the chat questions. One student asks, would you say that Soviets had a certain repetitive strategy of propaganda or messages maybe during Cold War? If it had, could you name most common ones, most common themes? And maybe especially looking into nowadays, maybe you see even repetition templates in nowadays Russian disinformation campaigns. Thank you, Aista, for the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the repetition is absolutely key. Mm-hmm. And they used, there was a guy who was the acting head of Romania's Foreign Intelligence Agency, Ion Mihai Pacepa. He defected in 1978 and he wrote a couple books on disinformation. And he says the head of KGB Foreign Intelligence from 1955 to 1970, this was a General Sakharovsky, told him, and this is something, it's not an offhand comment, this is how you do it. A drop makes a hole in a stone, not by force, but by constant dripping. So that's the method. You just constantly get into the media system of your target audience, false stories, and eventually, repetition has tremendous force. So that's a self-conscious strategy. And the second part of your question was, what were they? Well, when I was working in 1987, they love to talk about biological weapons, and the AIDS disinformation campaign was a biological weapon. Another one was assassinations. If a foreign leader somewhere was assassinated, CIA did that. Now we know that KGB has killed its own defectors in the UK, the SVR, rather, the Russian intelligence service. And we know that there was Cold War assassinations of Russian emigres, Soviet emigres, and defectors. So they use assassinations as a technique. The United States government actually, there was an executive order under President Reagan forbidding the use of assassination. And that's been renewed with every administration. But of course, they would use, there's a term, silent forgeries. Forgeries were the main way they had in the 50s and 60s and 70s to get into the Western media system. They didn't have, social media or the internet, RT. So they had a few of these controlled papers like the Patriot, but they would make a forgery, send it anonymously to a newspaper. You should publish this, and hopefully it would make a big stink. So apparently in Africa, we had people constantly going around to different embassies saying, no, it's not true that the CIA is planning to assassinate you. And where's your proof? Is it, well, then you go, a lot of times they'd have letterhead. They'd have a letterhead of some, my boss even had a forgery of USIA letterhead. And they would send invitations to people for holidays, Christmas, and then people would write back saying, oh, thank you, or I can't come, or I will come. And then they'd have the letterhead. So they collect all the letterhead. And Pachepa, in one of his books, he talks about they had thousands of letterhead. Now, when I looked at this South African forgery, I can't remember if I mentioned it now, but we went to the South African embassy. It was a forgery from the secretary, the foreign minister of South Africa about something. And we talked to the guys at the embassy. He says, well, this is on the letterhead of the South African foreign ministry. But if it was from the foreign minister, he has separate letterhead. So this couldn't be a correct document because he would use that. But they would collect these letterhead and they would use these in forgeries. So assassinations, biological weapons, anything that would scare the living daylights out of you, anything to activate fear, to, bypass your critical faculties. That would be what they would do. The organ trafficking story, child organ trafficking story, they didn't invent it, but they replayed it because they could tell a good story when they saw one. And depleted uranium, they didn't start it, but they repeated it. And even in the AIDS disinformation story, people have researched it. And this was in New York City. There was a lot of conspiracy theorists, the gay community in New York. Of course, AIDS spread very quickly, the gay community. And they thought maybe it's a government plot trying to get rid of us. Because now, 50 years later, everybody's very accepting of different sexual preferences. Because back in the 1980s, 1970s, it was different. So they study, Bittman says this, they study what's in the media of that country. They see what's playing, and then they reinforce it using their own methods. So that's the technique.
Yeah, Todd, sorry, just I have a full bucket of questions already in my chat
I'm
bot.
taking too long.
And I will try to structure those questions as well. Hearing you actually is a deja vu moment when you look into how contemporary disinformation campaigns and forgeries are done with, for example, allegations about rapes by NATO troops, and then emails being forged and sent out. So really, this is an important connection when we hear how things were done back in Soviet days and how things are now automated in many ways. But
Yes.
to move forward with questions, Vilius is asking, you mentioned those different, cultural differences back in the days, and then social movements. The question from Vilius is, how did the Cold War contribute to emergence of hippie movements in United States? And then the question, what impact did these movements have on a broader social climate during the era, right? The question probably relates to Vietnam, war and those social movements that played an important role and in relation to those propaganda battles.
Yes. Well, if I'd known you were going to ask this question, I would have brought a picture of me from 1972 where I had very long hair, because I went to college in 1968 and it was crazy because the whole thing was against Vietnam. And the worst thing a country can do, not the worst thing, but it was terrible what happened when a country loses a war. People turn against the core values of the country. And this happened in America after Vietnam. And this happened after our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are still affecting us. People become disgusted. I was talking with this old boss I used to work for in a construction company. He thinks America is a terrorist country because of what we did in Vietnam and what we did in Iraq. I said, Bird. He sort of looks like a bird, so his nickname is Bird. I said, Bird, you got to distinguish between stupidity and evil. Now, maybe we were clumsy in Vietnam, and it was really stupid to invade Iraq and think we could change these tribal societies into democracies. And yeah, we did a lot of harm, but that's different than countries that are evil. And honestly, I mean, it's an unfashionable word these days in sophisticated society, but evil is very real. Soviet Union is evil. Russia is evil. Putin, the regime, is evil. And they have no scruples. They'll do anything. And we have to guard against this. But no, I mean, there's tremendous harm was done by our defeats in Vietnam and in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think this has a lot to do with people being suspicious, people in America being suspicious of the government.
But then the question, Todd, sorry, but the question, then how those, emotions, social tensions are then used externally by this malign act. Can you relate to things that happened during protest against the Vietnam War with the hippie movement? Was this somehow manipulated by Soviets at the time, or was it just a natural internal clash?
I'd say it was a natural internal clash that was encouraged around the margins by foreign powers. Yes. I mean, they would chant ho 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 Chi Minh, the NLF, the National Liberation Front, is going to win. So yes, they would take advantage of this. This is something that happened internally, but of course, foreign powers are going to take advantage of this. And just today, there's a lot of controversy about the clash in Israel and Gaza, the war in Gaza against Hamas. There are major demonstrations. They're called pro-Palestinian. Well, they are organized by an organization called the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And this is a hardcore, hardline Communist Party. And they have a front group called Answer, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. This was formed quite a while ago. They're excellent at doing demonstrations. They print the placards. People come to the demonstration, they give them the placards, and half the time they don't know what they're protest, what they say. They've done questions from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They've asked them, what's the river and what's the sea? The Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. People don't even know. But this is a hardline Communist Party. It's internal, it's American, but it believes in the overthrow of capitalism in the United States. It's an old hardline Communist Party. And it's working against U.S. interests as are foreign countries. So it's not as if one is running the other, they're both working in the same direction. So you can have cooperation without coordination, or you can have coordination as well. It would depend on, judging from the surface, I don't see any coordination, but you'd have to have access to classified information to be more confident about that.
Okay, Todd, thank you. I have several questions in chat as well, but I know that those hands are, just visual technical hands, but it makes me anxious to actually invite those who are raising those hands to ask questions. Kęstuti, I see your hand. Can you pose your question?
And I'm glad to go on past the formal end time. So I'm happy.
Okay, Todd. Thank you. Kęstuti.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nerijus and Todd, for this great discussion. My question is related to freedom of expression because it's very related to disinformation. So I have so many questions for you, Todd, but I picked my one best, and I wonder if you are in favor of any kind of disinformation that you think would need it to be banned without further investigation, because this is where seems to me this is where we're heading towards in European Union sometimes, and without proper investigation, we seem to ban certain ideas, certain topics. So I really wonder if you think it's viable in your estimation.
Yeah, this is a very sensitive question and a very difficult question, because when you're countering disinformation, there are two things that are very, very important. One is to be very thorough in doing your research to make absolutely sure you're correct and can explain it correctly. And the other is to be very fast. And those two things, they're in conflict because you can be very fast and do a lousy job of research, or you can do a great job of research and be very slow. You want to do both if you can, and it's difficult. Now, if there's in the United States, we have First Amendment, it guarantees freedom of speech. But with the advent of the social media companies, that has gotten more complicated. And it's different in Europe, but I'll talk about the United States a little first, because typically when they say freedom of speech, First Amendment says there ain't limits on freedom of speech. It's pretty clear. But then if you have a social media company, Twitter or Facebook, I don't call it X, I call it Twitter. There are a lot of people communicate on these things, and the government doesn't tell them what to do, but they have their own social moderation policies because they don't want to let any crazy, you can't do pornography or violence, or, they have to have their code. So they're limiting speech on their platform only, not everywhere. And then, but that becomes, people think, and again, it's like depleted uranium. It sounds like censorship. It's not censorship, it's moderation, but people think of it as censorship. And then there's groupthink. Like there was when COVID was, burst onto the world scene in late 2019, there was two theories. One that it's natural origin, and the other that it was a lab leak. Now, at first, everybody would say, "Oh no, it couldn't possibly be a lab leak," and that's a conspiracy theory. And they were forbidding, these social media companies forbidding this on their websites because that's a conspiracy theory. But now it's become more respectable, and certain parts of the U.S. government believe it's likely. Although, they're not, they have low confidence, moderate confidence, high confidence. Different parts of the U.S. intelligence community have different levels of confidence. But it's certainly not a conspiracy theory. It's something to be investigated. So you can make mistakes. Anybody can make mistakes. And then people take this as censorship. In the European Union, they have different policies. They may limit RT and Sputnik. I don't have a problem with that because those are putting out false stories. Also, they can put out true stories. They can put out true stories if they think to their benefit. But they're going to only put out information that's to their benefit. They're not honest brokers. Sorry, there's my phone ringing in the background. My wife will pick it up soon, I think.
No problem. We don't hear it. No problem.
Very difficult. It's impossible to do this perfectly, and everybody struggles with it.
Mm. Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate this aspect of speed because it's especially, the difference when the speed was of Cold War time, debunking, and now it's a totally, other thing. But the light speed of lies and then debunking. That's the great challenge. Now I'm back onto chat questions. And then I will ask Andrius his question. So in the chat, Gabi asks a really good question. I actually had this written for myself as well. So the question she poses, I will read the whole one. It's a good question. You talked about the importance of the deconstructing disinformation campaign in order to counter it. Have you ever dealt with campaigns that you were not able to deconstruct with information that was available at the time? And how would you explain the persistence of some of the conspiracy theories that have been deconstructed multiple times, but they continue to have strong resonance in the society? Like flat earthers and so on. But what it boils down to, this question, is countering disinformation, which is based on emotions and subconscious associations, by logic and rationality, effective. Maybe you have examples how to counter that, that subconscious mind. So the question is this.
Yeah, no, there are ways to counter it. And look, the basic fact is nobody likes to be manipulated and lied to. So if you can establish that somebody's lying to you and manipulating you, then people are not going to like it. So that's what you have to do, and you have to expose what they're doing and explain it. And it works. It can work very well. There are some, I remember one, this goes back a long time, but probably 30 years ago, there was this story about Gladio. Now, I don't know if everybody's ever heard of Gladio, but it was an actual plan by NATO countries for stay behind forces to resist. It's created after World War II. Remember, in World War II, the Nazis, conquered pretty much all of Europe, and then there were different guerrilla or resistance organizations. But this is a very difficult business. So they said, look, this is in the 1950s. If the Soviet Union conquers Europe, there's going to be similar, we want there to be similar resistance to that. So let's, create a stay behind resistance organization. Let's create the nucleus of one with some, maybe hiding some weapons in different sites, so that if it happens, we'll have the better opportunity to resist. If it doesn't happen, who cares? It's just a contingency. So this was a real policy. I'm not sure it was a NATO policy or individual countries. But then this got, the Russians knew about this, the Soviets, and they said, well, this is a big conspiracy. These are people doing assassinations, blah, blah, blah. And then, so this is from the 1950s. So I'm dealing with this in the late 80s. And you have to go back and you have to find out what's going on. And you find out that, yeah, it's true that there was a stay behind organization, but no, they weren't assassinating people. And then you say, well, what if somebody did? What if there was some crazy person who, on his own initiative, not as a matter of policy, knew where some of these weapons were and did something? You drive yourself crazy because you can't investigate everything in something like this. So after a while, I just gave up. I decided it's too complicated to try to explain what's true, what's half true, and what's not true at all. Because, you don't want a complicated message. It's too much work for the audience, and it's not good communications policy. So I just let it go.
Okay, Todd, thanks. Now Andrews has his hand. Can we ask you to pose your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So thanks, Todd, for the lecture. It was very interesting. I have a quick question about TikTok and how it's a difficult tool to fight against propaganda, because in America, you have freedom of speech, and a lot of users try to defend the TikTok platform by saying it's freedom of speech, First Amendment. Yet we see a lot of campaigns started, propaganda campaigns in TikTok. So my question would be, what legislative, what policies could state or country or European countries take against social media platforms to fight against propaganda? Another question would be, is it our country's mistake that now people are getting their news from social media, not from reliable sources of news?
Well,
thank you, Andrew. And I will add another question from the chat in the end, because there's a question. Then, what news sources would you suggest then to stick with, and what you trust and recommend reading? Okay, that's Aista's question as well. Okay.
Yeah, well, in terms of things to check, I mean, the old established newspapers and media are the best because they have different levels of editorial policy and levels of editorial checking. I worked at Voice of America, I said, for a while, and they had a two-source. A lot of media organizations have a two-source rule, in that you can't, just because one person tells you a story, you can't publish it. You got to have that checked. And if you got two independent sources, then you can publish it. And that's a great policy. It makes it more difficult to break news quickly, but it makes you more reliable. And a lot of the professional, my wife has a friend who works for CBS. They check stuff very, very thoroughly. And when they were they had heard of this baby part story, they called me, they check stuff very thoroughly. So the mainstream media does a very good job. But look, social media is the way of the future. I'm a dinosaur. I grew up, I still get the Washington Post hard copy. I read the New York Times online, but I get the newspaper hard copy. That's, if some person says, who watches the evening news? Is old people and their parents. It's a joke. But I don't like broadcast news because I prefer to read my news rather than to watch it. But they're very reliable. But of course, the move to social media, it's very engaging, very quick. It's happening. It's already happened for younger generations like yourselves. So this is inevitable. Now, I don't know a great deal about TikTok because, of course, it's tied up with China, not Russia's my main focus has been over the years. But as I understand it, and I'm not saying I know everything, but my understanding is there's an American subsidiary called TikTok, but it's part of a Chinese ByteDance, Chinese company. And what they're trying to do in the United States is to get the company separated. So you can have a company that's TikTok, but it's not part of a Chinese company. Because as I understand it, a Chinese company, if you own a Chinese company, the government can tell us, we want you to give us the information on your users or whatever. You're at the whim of whatever the government wants. And Chinese government is it's got a lot of control over media in their country. So I think what they're trying to do is to separate ownership of the American subsidiary from the Chinese parent company. And that's not easy. Even if China wasn't involved, it's a big company, you got to find a buyer. So I don't know how that's going, but that's one way to approach the problem. And then the company becomes subject to the laws of the country in which it's based. They don't have to worry about it being subject to Chinese authorities. But social media is the way of the future, it's the way of the present. And we have to adjust to that reality.
Okay, thank you, Todd. And I think the final question, if somebody still has, you can raise a hand, but from Asma, do you believe that misinformation and propaganda today are more adeptly crafted and occasionally even scientifically biased, making it increasingly challenging to distinguish truth from fiction, especially when disseminated by well-organized and influential media institutions? If so, how can we defend ourselves against it or counteract this pervasive misinformation? And maybe as a kind of a concluding on this question, so those lessons to be learned from all your experience and in fighting this kind of misinformation, what would you maybe suggest as a recipe for us in Lithuania, generally in the West, to counter Russian disinformation? So here's the question, and here's my edited question on top.
Sure. No, those are all very, very good points. I mean, I'd say, yeah, misinformation and disinformation are disinformation in particular is a bigger problem than ever. And that's because it doesn't have to be scientifically based so much as a lot of practice, a lot of trial and error. I mean, the companies in the United States, sometimes they're trying to design the best cover for a magazine because the cover for a magazine can make a huge difference in people who buy it or not, right? So you can try figuring out using somebody's intuition what's going to be best. Different experts can disagree. But one of the things they do is called A/B testing. They try one cover in one city and one cover in another city, and they see which sells the best. And then from trial and error, which from experience, which works the best, and that's the one you choose. So it's the same thing with disinformation. You can just try there's a saying, you throw spaghetti against the wall and you see what sticks. You know, I mean, it's, and then that's what you use. So I think it can be scientific, but a lot of this is intuition, and a lot of it is just experimentation. If you're conducting enough experiments, you're going to find out what works and what doesn't work, and then you reinforce that and you go with that, and that teaches you better for the next time. Now, how we defend against it, I think, is with people who are spokespeople, because you have to have, the defense has to be in the media. You can't have, I mean, for example, you have specialized organizations. EU versus disinformation is one very good one, you know, in the European Union. They're tracking all these things, but it's a publication for specialists. The ordinary reader doesn't do it. So what you want is you want to get specialized information into mass media that people will read. And the way I used to do this was give interviews, you know, because this was a great story. Journalists love this story of disinformation or misinformation because it's exciting. You know, it's like the hidden truth. So it's a good story. But now it's a struggle to do this because, you know, if you have a bureaucracies are sort of self-perpetuating organizations, and you want them to be lean and mean. You want them to be, you know, able to do the best that they can. And I think the way you do this, you could have measures of effectiveness being stories in the mass media, not the amount of stories that you publish on your website, whatever it is, but stories you get in the mass media. And in Lithuania, I mean, there's very good, you know, I'm drawing a blank. I'm very, very embarrassed, but you know, I wrote, when I was writing disinformation dispatches for Global Engagement Center, the first one was on a Lithuanian company that counters misinformation by scraping all these websites and then
it could be Debunk.eu, maybe.
Debunk.eu, of course.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Victoris. So, you know,
exactly. We were meeting you with Victoras in Washington, D.C. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I later, you know, I spent some time going back and forth with him, and I wrote this first counter disinformation dispatch with Victoris. So that's a great system. They find all the articles that have disinformation. You get somebody to research it, and then it gets presented to the mass media who can write a story about it. Now, an advantage of Lithuania is a very small country. Okay, I mean, you know, a couple million people, 2-3 million people. So it gets more difficult as you get larger and larger. So, but one of the things that Global Engagement Center, I mean, we were hurt in the United States because, you know, I say Gorbachev ruined my career and Putin revived it, right? Because I was doing great from 1987 to 1991, and he destroyed the Soviet Union, and I still kept doing misinformation, countering misinformation, but it wasn't quite the same. And when people started paying attention to this after the first invasion in 2014, first Russian invasion of Ukraine, we'd lost all our infrastructure. You know, you had to start again from scratch, and you got a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing. And sometimes they listened to me. A lot of times they didn't listen to me because they had their own ideas. You know, everybody thinks they know more than, you know, the old guy. So it's tough to recreate a government bureaucracy. But one thing that is very good is the governments can do that private organizations can't do, is they have access to intelligence information. And I would recommend going to the State Department's Disarming Disinformation website. And you'll find several reports there. And more, some of these recent reports on Russian propaganda in Africa and Latin America, and the story in the Washington Post today They're based on intelligence information that was gathered by European or American intelligence agencies, and it shows exactly what they're doing. There's no ambiguity, and it's very solid, very reliable information. So, and I was reading a Time magazine article. I'll write about this in my Substack later. There's a thing they're calling strategic declassification. And this is what I did, some of what I did when I was writing reports. You get something that's classified, and it says, well, you can get part of it declassified if you ask permission from the intelligence community. Say, I want to say this. Is this okay? And they say either yes or no. They change it, and then you can use it. And what they're doing is more and more of this. It started with the second invasion in 22 years ago of Ukraine, where the U.S. government released the plans that they had to create phony events. Like there was some, the Ukrainian government was supposedly oppressing people in the country, and that's why the Russians had to intervene to rescue them. And they were creating a phony event with people killed and whatnot. So the U.S. intelligence agencies found this, and they declassified it. And once they declassify it, the Russians can't do it because we've already said you're going to do this, and if you do it, everybody knows it's phony. So that's more and more. That's a very good way to expose some of these larger disinformation operations. That's not the day-to-day stuff. The day-to-day stuff, you see that it's out in the open. You need people who follow it every day, who are totally immersed in all the minutia, and they can talk to the press about it. But the other is the exposing these big operations, and governments can do that and should do that and are doing it. And those are two of the ways to counter it. I hope that answers your question, at least in part.
Okay, I mean, I totally understand that there is no golden recipe, one solution. But your experience and your story, I think, enriches us in so many ways. Just to have those relations to what is going on right now, to the things that you are saying. I think you are kind of a debunker of this other generation. You are telling your story how you were doing this back in the days, and now we have all those high-tech debunking organizations, media entities doing the same probably thing, just with all this new technology.
Right.
And this, but the strategic kind of a thinking is still, still stays and should actually be shared amongst those decades. So Todd, thank you very much for the time you spent with us. A round of virtual applause from our students and audience to you for this really enriching conversation. And I hope that we will continue this, because it's not, fighting disinformation networks needs to have other counter networks, networks of allies. So really, I'm looking forward to continue these discussions. Thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion. The lecture was transmitted online on YouTube. So if you are willing to kind of rewind some really excellent thoughts, you can do that.